Hey everyone, welcome to Neighbor Science, the only non-bootlicking podcast about political economy or anime.
Hell yeah.
Yeah, the only non-bootlicking podcast about political economy and the only non-bootlicking podcast about anime.
Sure. Yeah.
Wow, we're taking both titles.
It's hanging on that
uh,
belt.
so today we are talking about a rather bootlicking anime and using that to segue into a non-bootlicking discussion of Ecocommunist Utopia. First of all, I just want to get out of the way. This whole thing that's happening on Dr. Stone. So currently in the show, Senku is putting together the technology to make sulfa drugs, which are like a early industrial like chemical medication. It's an antibiotic used to cure a wide variety of illnesses. But there's one thing in particular that really rubbed me the wrong way, where he was talking about like the futuristic civilization that was left behind when everything reverted to the Anprim utopia of the show, and it like makes it extremely explicit that he is talking about statist fossil fuel technologies, because everything that he is imagining when he's talking about this is oil refineries, chemical plants, and all that kind of shit. So he's saying like specifically like, I want to bring back the exact civilization that we had before everything went back to the eco-utopia that we're in right now, where
No.
people don't seem to have that many problems comparatively to what was going on before everything went to be like
Right.
that. There's like,
Right.
he's in this village that he's like trying to radicalize into his pro-statist, pro-civilization ideology. And their biggest problem is like the like princess type person in this village of like 30 people. She has an illness, and so she's going to die before she becomes like matriarch of the village or whatever. Hence why he's making these sulfa drugs. And some people have blurry vision, which like only affects their ability to do like ceremonial one-to-one combat with other people to take the throne of the village.
That
So
is
it's like,
fascinating.
wow, those are really bad problems. We should bring back the, massive widespread like war and genocide
Yeah, right.
that was happening right before everything went to like this.
Right. Yeah, that seems right. That seems like a good idea.
Yeah. I mean, obviously, like, we don't even have to think about it. It's just obvious, just so obviously a good idea to bring back oil, because there was this ecological disaster that happened to destroy civilization. And by ecological disaster, I mean the ecosystem is thriving, and that's a disaster.
Right. This can't be allowed to go on.
Yeah. If we don't have civilization, how will we cure all the illnesses caused by civilization with drugs produced by civilization? Bet you didn't think about that. How will nearsighted people be able to read spreadsheets to do their job in your your Anprim utopia?
I just can't even imagine. Well, unfortunately, I can imagine, actually. I know enough people that would probably go this way. I'm just thinking about, like, what kind of person would, like, be faced with, like, this sort of post-civ, ecotopia, and then be like, no, we have to go back. Or, like, we have to, like, do the other thing, like that's the pinnacle of human achievement, and it represents, like, sort of a human triumph over the world. And, like, oh, God. Trash can of ideology and all that.
My favorite argument though is like, Tsukasa might be, he might have his heart in the right place, but like, I can't support mass murder. So let's support the guy who wants to bring back modern civilization.
Yeah. Damn it.
No better way to oppose mass murder than bringing back oil and the state. Fuck. So we have decided today to talk about something we don't really touch on very much at all, which is what would our eco-communist utopia look like? We're both utopians. Every single person that has ever been on our show is a utopian who has Googled Murray Bookchin and agrees with us on everything. So just so you know, all of our views are fully endorsed by every past guest, including the ones we're about to express today. So
totally, yeah.
Yeah. So we're going to talk about what our eco-communist utopia would look like. So, I mean, obviously we can only speculate what it would look like, but let's go ahead and do that because it's fun and cool to imagine things,
Yeah, I liked it. I like this idea.
So the first thing I wanted to start with was food, because that's one of the most important things about our daily life. Right behind air and water, am I right? Mondays, huh?
I love pizza.
So we want to know, in the eco-communist utopia, how do we get epic bacon? That's the most pressing issue.
Yeah.
So for me, I want to start with the site of production. So let's start with agriculture, the original source of production for food, which I think if it's going to survive, it's going to more resemble like pastoralism and forestry than modern agriculture does, because modern agriculture, of course, is what's called monoculture, where they take an entire plot of land and they just kill everything except for the one thing that you want to grow. And in order to make sure that only that thing grows, you spray it with deadly chemicals that kill all bugs and fungus and weeds and just everything, and ideally for Senku's civilization, the corn that you're growing in your field, you can just spray it with poison and it's immune to poison and everything around it just dies.
Right.
And that poison is supposedly okay for human consumption. We haven't we don't have a whole lot of data on that, but rest assured, you are not being poisoned by your food. So for eco-communist food production, everything will be more like the food forest, the permaculture farm, where everything is an ecosystem, including your food. So you may be growing multiple food crops. You may be growing a food crop with a bunch of non-food crops.
Yep.
They will be doing what's called management-intensive grazing, which is where animals that eat, mostly non-food crops, like fodder crops, they graze on the things that you don't want, and then they poop out free fertilizer for you to put on the stuff that you do want, which just grows in place, and then you just harvest it, and everything's great. Food production sites should be like vibrant lands teeming with trees and shrubs and vines and grasses and mammals and birds and insects and fungi and yeasts and so on. Everything should be there because everything is important to the process of life thriving, which is what food is. It's life.
Yep.
So
yes, we eat life, and that's really the most difficult, but also the most magical part. Yeah, it's interesting. Like, we could get into like what the James C. Scott, right? That's his initial. Like Against the Grain and all that shit about and of course other critics of like the state and civilization. About like
we will
how
not be growing grains because they are statist. We will only be growing potatoes and other tubers and vegetables.
Yeah. We'll basically just like be eating like dirt babies.
Yeah.
Yeah.
If you want rice in our utopia, fuck off.
Yeah, fuck right off. I don't give a fuck how good.
May as well join the fascists now.
Yeah, right. Sushi's out. But yeah, like the whole concept of like certain crops being favored by the state because of quantification, and like quantification being like a kind of what's that fucking term? Kind of like a MacGuffin, I guess is one of the sort of pop culture terms for like an all powerful tool. Yeah, like a magical all powerful tool, and like quantification is like the state's crack, which is why capitalism is so durable, is because capitalism is just like the apotheosis of a particular type of statism, or like state.
Capitalism is the most rational type of state.
Right.
And I don't mean that in terms of like it's the most good idea. I mean like literally in terms of like rationalism, which is like a philosophy where ratios of numbers are like govern the laws of the universe, and if you can discover the perfect ratios, then you can achieve perfection through technical management. It's like I think it's like a 18th century philosophy, but it pervades our society completely. Yeah. And the thing with like grains being statist is like basically they all mature at the same time. They are accountable and measurable, and they can be easily stolen, which is like one of the biggest things. So like if you're growing a bunch of potatoes, they all mature at different times. They're stuck in the ground, so they take quite a bit of work to harvest them.
Get them. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Find them, dig them up.
Yeah. But if you're growing grains, then the state's goons can just come and just cut them all down and throw them on a cart and take them from you.
Yeah, exactly.
And that's the whole point of growing grains.
Yeah, exactly. It's funny because, so this links to this kind of like, I don't know exactly. I'll just call it one of my crackpot theories, right? But and I kind of colorfully called it my my first chariot hypothesis, which is that like essentially like the first group to invent something like a chariot or something that had that kind of mobility and like war power, was probably like they basically were like the original like vector for like state violence, because they could roll up quickly and like do exactly what you just described to like an agrarian community. So then they realized like, oh, all we have to do is like cart over, like threaten and or kill some people, threaten, hurt, or kill, and then just take their shit and run off, and then they realized they could do that and manage it like over time,
Right.
So they weren't just thieves or raiders anymore. It was big business. It was mafia shit, and so that was kind of like, that was my hypothesis. I'm sure somebody else has actually fleshed out a dissertation about this kind of thing, but like it was something that I was like just fiddling with in grad school before I went off.
I know the earliest evidence of an unequal society is like a fishing village where certain fishing spots had much better yields than others.
Okay.
And so the people that claimed the good fishing spots, they were able to stockpile food and provide it to people who were going through hard times, who then obviously were like in their debt.
Yep.
And
they created leverage. Yep.
Be manipulated by them. Yeah, exactly.
And then they're like, oh, you can give me other things. You can give me your daughters or your sons or your fucking other goods. And yeah.
And so for the next stage of production, which is, I'll just skip ahead to, cooking the food. One of the main community features that I've long envisioned for an eco-communist utopia, and something that could be fairly easily prefigurative, I think, is a communal kitchen / cafeteria to replace restaurants.
Yep.
So like basically it would resemble a restaurant, except there would be far less of a divide between the kitchen, the front of house, and the back of house.
Yep, exactly.
the kitchen would be a public place. And so anyone would be encouraged to go into the kitchen and prepare food, help with the preparation process, help clean up or whatever. And, ideally, in a given community, you would have enough people there where, some people love cooking. I like cooking sometimes.
Yeah.
The main thing that sucks about it is I have to work 40 hours a week.
Right, exactly.
And so I don't want to do more work after I'm done with that. But even so, like, sometimes I spend a few hours cooking, and it's pretty fun.
Yeah.
And it would be a lot more fun if I had, like, much nicer equipment, which is another thing that would be an advantage in, like, a community kitchen.
Exactly. And a community kitchen could basically benefit from the same kind of, either the library socialism kind of idea, or just like a kind of just a more informal, just this is the kitchen where all the cooking stuff is, just use it and put it back, so it's like not quite like a library because it's also the workspace.
It's a restaurant library.
Right, yeah, exactly. And what I was thinking too is that it would resemble in a lot of ways just like a lot of those really like hip or sort of highly designed restaurants where it's got that open format, Although my brother actually works at a diner that has like an open kitchen, like the grill that they work on is right, like just literally behind like the fucking like display, what do you call it? The display bar that they put like their pastries and cakes in, and then behind
the pastry case, the
pastry case and everything like that, and then they're like behind that is like a full bank of grills and shit that they just cook on. And so it's one of those restaurants, and so it's like it's the same fucking format, but then people could like like you said,
no one would tell you to get out if you went back there and started helping.
Right, exactly. And like, what would be the point, And because everybody be used to using it, there'd be like a lot less risk of fuck ups, and people, like, more people would be familiar with how to do it. They wouldn't be just fucking helpless like a lot of people are now because of our kind of de-skilling and our alienation. And
I think another important thing would be like not only like a lack of de-skilling, but people working together in a community would, like, that's how you create culture.
Yep,
and
exactly.
Like food cultures are created by people sharing ideas about food.
Yep.
And sharing knowledge about food, and without the what's it called, perverse incentive of making money.
Exactly.
Yeah,
from just like a creative effort.
You have like, there's no reason for you not to share your recipes. There's no reason to have like a secret recipe unless you're just like a narcissistic fucking weirdo that doesn't want to tell people how to make delicious food.
Exactly. Yeah, the only thing is basically pathology or fear in a profit system. Like literally existential fear.
What if I want to monetize this one day?
Right. And also,
I have considered not sharing recipes for that exact reason. Like, but if I start a business making my kratom tea, then everyone will know my recipe.
Yeah. That's I was gonna say also, like, it would also be still totally viable and popular to have different communal kitchen restaurants with different like specialties, because like, of course, people want variety, and equipment is literally specialized for different varieties of food, and so you're like, oh well, I want to go to the place that's gonna be able technically to make this particular kind of food, so that's a different communal kitchen restaurant, and you go and maybe like
you know, maybe the Ethiopian kitchen in DC,
right?
Ethiopian food.
exactly. And like, you say, oh, like I kind of want this, and maybe you're not the person who's good at that, so you go find them and you say, hey, like, either they're your friends and so you kind of work something out, do a little mutual aid, or they just do it because they fucking want to, because it's awesome, because they love you. Let's not forget about that. And then, or if it's somebody maybe you don't know so well, or who's out of the neighborhood, like they maybe like they're outside of your particular commune,
Yeah.
Then that's when you could just be like, hey, like we'll have some nice, easy kind of trade agreement, whatever, that replaces like the monetary transactions that we're familiar with,
Right. And like I want to get one argument out of the way now, which is like people wonder like, okay, well, if we're not getting paid to do stuff,
right,
then like how do we make sure it gets done?
Well,
in the case of like food, for example, if you don't get it done, you will die.
You will fucking die.
So
exactly.
You better just do it, motherfucker.
Yeah. Like, that's the interesting thing. You mentioned culture, and I'm glad you did, because so much of what a few people have actually tweeted in different forms recently is that basically, like, the vast majority, it's the bullshit jobs argument, right? The vast majority of quote unquote work, wage work and salary work and everything else in capitalism is worthless, or it is there simply to kind of bureaucratically prop up and reify and legitimize capitalist processes and structures. Everything else is actual material production, or it is cultural production, or both, right?
Yes.
I mean, I should say material production is cultural production, but like not in the sense of like art usually. But
there's also reproduction.
Right, exactly. So then you basically just you sort of deflate that whole fucking blister of like bullshit, and then you go all the way down to just shit that people naturally want to fucking do, and that's what you're talking about in this society, right?
Yeah.
So it's like, of course people want to fucking cook, and if they're going to cook, they're going to try to make it good, and if they're going to try to make it good, why not share? Like, it's fucking natural. And if you want something you can't make, you'll find a way to get it. That's like a primary component of human intelligence. Like, that's what we're about as a species, is getting shit we can't get ourselves, or make ourselves, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those things where, like, I mean, the wages in the restaurant industry are generally like so low.
Yeah.
Especially if you're back of house. And like basically like the lower the wages are for something, this doesn't apply to everything obviously, but like the lower the wages are for something generally, the more people just want to do it anyway. Mm-hmm. Because that's like, I mean, that's why the wages are low, is because like people want to do it anyway.
People would rather do that.
They'll take whatever shitty like rations you give them.
Yes.
So I think there's going to be plenty of people who will want to contribute to the community kitchen.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
And so the last thing I want to do for this is, I mean, this will apply to other stuff, but like the energy sources for cooking. What are they? So for electricity, there's solar electricity, there's wind power. One thing about wind power that maybe not a lot of people think about is like the wind power that we use mostly, like the overwhelming majority of it is like this high tech wind turbine with neodymium iron boron magnets with doped with dysprosium so that they can run at high speeds and high heat, and they have like all these advanced materials like composite windmill blades, and they produce like huge amounts of electricity for like a single windmill. But there's also a much simpler technology, which is just like a normal like simple turbine with wooden blades and a wooden stick holding it up.
Yep.
And those are perfectly fine, and they work to generate electricity, and in a lot of cases they're actually more efficient because they don't require like those advanced windmills take a lot of energy to make. Yep. And so you need to generate more energy over its lifetime to like make that worth it.
Yes, exactly.
Whereas like a couple pieces of wood, you can cut those down by hand, you can cut them by hand, you can put them up by hand, and that's
easily
very
replaced.
little energy wasted, and so you can like recover a lot from it. But anyway, like for heat sources, which are like the main concern in the kitchen, we could use coppiced wood, which can be turned. You can just cut it as like little sticks and feed it into a stove. You can pelletize it, which makes it burn more evenly and lets you like automatically feed it instead of having to like shove it into a chute or whatever.
Yep.
It can also be turned into wood gas, which is a kind of a forgotten technology. Like during World War II, most cars in Europe were converted to run on wood gas. So they had this little reactor on them where you stick wood chips inside of it, and it turns the gas it turns the wood into syngas, which can then be burned by normal combustion engines.
Nice.
It can also be turned into alcohol using reactors. You can also use solar heat, like in a solar cooker, or you can use it for convection heating to heat up fluids, either air or water. And in some places like Iceland, there's kitchens that are just hooked up straight to geothermal steam vents, and they just cook with steam. And that's actually faster than using like a gas stove. So there's a lot of like really good technologies that can be used for heating food and other stuff too. All those heat sources also apply to like housing and shit like that, and industry. Well, not so much industry because you usually need higher heat for that. But anyway, so the next thing, let's move on to travel. Do you want to start with travel? Do you have anything for that?
Travel. Well, I advocate walking, but yeah, you've got a good point here that we can just start with, which is one of the reasons that high-speed travel is so essential these days is because we are forced to work full-time jobs and we cannot just take time off. So that right there is the key, and I think about it a lot because I love traveling. I grew up pretty much in a nomadic lifestyle. You know, we would settle for maybe like several months to a year, or maybe 2 years at like a stretch, but like usually we were like bouncing in and out. I have literally moved over 70 times in my life at this point, and I'm about to move again. So like, yeah, we're talking about like moving a lot, and that takes a toll on your expenses and stuff, but also it means there's a lot of coordination involved because of like job issues and rent and all this bullshit, which just
carrying all your dang stuff with you. God.
Yeah, exactly. So I try to pack light. But yeah, like one of the main reasons that high speed travel, which itself is kind of wasteful because you're going through all this land and you don't even get to like enjoy and appreciate it, right? So that in itself is robbing you of like so much of the magic of travel itself, the act of travel.
The only good thing about it is you can see the curvature of the Earth and prove
right.
for all that the Earth isn't flat.
Right. Like, yeah, if we're talking about like air travel, yeah, definitely the curvature of the Earth. You know, you get like a nice skyline, and like it's the clouds, and you're also like, oh man, I hope this whole thing doesn't go down, and we die screaming in like 3 minutes. You know, because the engineers can't be bothered to design a plane with fucking parachutes in it, because as was explained to me by a Boeing engineer I knew, it's too expensive to save lives.
Oh, and your roommate explained it even better, which is like if a civilian plane goes down, then it's just a tragedy, but if a military plane goes down, then it's an act of war.
Right, exactly. So like cities don't get those fucking luxuries of security. Yeah. We go through all this fucking bureaucracy and trauma just to get on the fucking plane these days, and then if the plane goes down, they don't give a fuck. It's just a fucking they write it off basesbasically, you know.
It's crazy that most of our friends, like the ones that have been on this podcast and stuff, have never experienced an airport before it was a giant police state.
Yeah. Oh my god, it used to be
insane,
so easy.
Man.
It used to be so easy.
Like, my dad was an air traffic controller, and he used to be able to just ask if they had an extra seat in the cockpit and ride for free.
Yeah, that was really normal back in the day.
And he would, like, talk to the pilot and be like, hey, can my son come talk to you? And they'd be like, yeah, sure.
Yeah,
and then I would come up and, like, they would let me play with the controls, and then they would, they would give you, like, these little pilot wings that you could pin on yourself. And shit. It was, like, very cool. And then, And Brian from Street Fight pointed out one time, like it used to be a place where like it was like one of the best places to hang out if you were stoned, because you could just be a shithead and like nobody would care because everyone's like too busy going to their flight.
Right, it's just a fancy bus terminal. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah. Yeah. And like, I mean, yeah, I think the point about working full time can't be overstated because, like, you know, in the Eco-Communist Utopia, if you want to travel somewhere, you go. Okay, let's start with our current society. All right, if you want to travel to Europe, first of all, you need the money to do that, which you probably don't have.
Right.
Second, you need to have been working at the place you're working at for long enough to accrue vacation time.
Yep.
You need to have enough vacation hours.
Yep.
You need to ask your boss for permission to use those vacation hours, which often they can just say no.
Just say no, right? Exactly.
Yeah. You need to take care of any other obligations. Like, you still need to pay the same amount of rent, even though you're not going to be at home.
Yep.
You need to, like, shut off your mail so that your mailbox doesn't fill up. You got to have your friends or neighbors or family take care of any pets or plants that you have.
Right. You got kids,
just a bunch of other
spouse,
shit.
Other family shit going on. You got to take care of all that. Yep.
You got to go through the police state in the airport to get onto the airplane. Which,
right.
Oh yeah, you also have to buy a ticket to get on the airplane, which is a whole fucking nightmare. Which involves like waiting until the right moment when the price is low. And you might get bumped off anyway.
Right.
They might tell you to go on the next flight, or what have you.
Yeah.
You need to go through customs on both sides. Have a passport. There's like all this border militarization.
I was just gonna say all this dumbass border shit, which shouldn't exist.
Yeah. And then compare that with the Eco-Communist Utopia. So you go to your friends and family and be like, hey, I'm gonna go fuck off to Europe for like a month or so. I just feel like it.
Yep.
And that that doesn't include the travel time, which is like if you're in DC, you would go. Well, I mean, obviously DC wouldn't exist because it just needs to be leveled. But
I was gonna say, DC, I thought about what would DC look like after capitalism, and it would just be like a tiny little town, like the size of Providence.
Yeah.
Like, it would just be like the local worker
without the mall.
And exactly, and just that's it. Like the fucking Alexandria and other waterfronts would just be restored to the people. And all the monuments would be, something would be done with them, and then like all the public buildings would just be turned into, just like in any fucking Soviet bloc country or something, it would just be turned into something else.
Yeah.
Thank God, and but like the population would be like half of what it is now.
So yeah, you tell your friends and family you're leaving. If you have any pets, you can bring them with you if you want.
Yep.
If you have any house plants, I guess you still have to take care of those. You have to have someone take care of those.
Sure.
So you take you walk or you take the streetcar or whatever to the port, and you get on a boat. You just ask them, hey, you got an extra spot for me?
Right.
And are you going to I don't know, fucking what's a port town in Europe? Nice? I don't know.
Yeah. I nearly had it.
You go to a port town, and then you get on the boat, and it goes across the Atlantic Ocean, and then you're there, and that's it. You do whatever you want.
Yeah, exactly. And what's interesting is like this is where people say, well, how do you pay for fare? How do you pay for anything once you're there? And this is something that I've kind of wrestled with because you can hope that people will sort of just like give you food and stuff.
Yeah.
But like that's never guaranteed. But I guess like then you can come back to the like post scarcity argument of like, why wouldn't they? Right? Like you just show up and you're like, hey, where do I get food? And they'd be like, oh yeah, well, there's a variety of options. And then they're like, well, we've got our community kitchen restaurant over here where you're free to cook a bunch of bangers and mash or curry or whatever, or we got this one over here that's a little newer where somebody's teaching people how to make authentic sushi, but with like locally caught fish, and you're like, oh, that's so cool. Let me engage in culture. This isn't some fucking tourist shit. This is like actually traveling and being part of it, which would be
that's
incredible.
Another thing that I didn't think about is tourism, as we know it, wouldn't exist because the whole point of tourism now is to attract rich foreigners.
Yep.
Who
dumb shit.
Yeah, they have the rations that you need from the state, and you need to get them from them. So you perform some service for them. Yeah. Either something like relatively normal, like serving the local cuisine, but maybe tailored for their tastes.
Yeah.
Or something darker, like doing sex work for rapists, basically.
Right. Yeah.
And none of that shit would exist. Yeah. And as for travel food, I know I railed against grains earlier, but maybe bring some onigiri with you or some pemmican or something.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. Actually, speaking of tourism again, like this actually brings me back to I mentioned that we grew up moving around quite a lot, and there were a few things that were induced by that experience. There was like a big cultural difference that I've had because of that with like pretty much most people. And I'm not trying to be a snob. That's not the point. I'm not saying I'm better. I'm just saying like there's a distinct kind of like difference that develops. One thing is that I've noticed, I would say this a lot to people, and I would say I still stick to this to some extent. There's two basic categories of people that you don't often notice until you've actually moved around a lot, which is that there are people who are kind of inherently nomadic, and there's people who are inherently like settlers, or like they stay in place, right? And
let's say sedentary, because
sedentary, right?
Connotations.
Right. Has that kind of connotation, right? And then actually, speaking of those connotations, the other thing was that I said, everybody that goes to a different country wants to call themselves a traveler, but most of those people are actually tourists. There is a difference between a tourist and a traveler, right? And so that's actually, you get all these like Instagram fuckers who are like, their parents are millionaires and shit, and they just like go fucking spend shit in some quote unquote exotic country, and they come back and say it changed their lives and nothing actually happened. They just like fucked some French guy, whatever it might be.
Now
tourists.
Now I'll use the tragedy of third world countries to bludgeon people with my moralizing statements.
Exactly.
That's how my life has changed.
Exactly. And so it becomes very, very clear that like tourism, whatever the intent of the tourist, right? Like I think a lot of people really are just trying to, as we've kind of described in its elements, they're trying to escape capitalism for some brief moment. Right.
Yeah.
The people who actually have to save for a vacation and go somewhere else, those are the people who really need that. But tourism is structured and designed to basically be simulated colonialism, like simulated colonial lifestyle. And so that's where it becomes very like interesting and like in a sort of academic way, I guess, in an analytical sense, but like very creepy, of course. And so that's where you're like, okay, like the people who are engaging with it sort of naively because they're just trying to escape the capitalistic structures of wherever they're from, and they're trying to travel, but they're engaging in the tourist industry to do so, they probably have no idea that they're engaging in this like simulated colonial lifestyleism, right? This kind of LARPing, and then you've got like the really bougie types who they call themselves travelers. They're, oh my God, I'm a free spirit. But they're the most colonial people.
Yes.
They're the neo-lib colonial types, and then again, there are the people who actually travel who are like, however they move their bodies from
they're working odd jobs where they go so that they can
right or they when they get to a place they're actually engaging with the culture as it is, as opposed to how it's being sold to them. Right. They're making friends, like real friends, they're learning the language. That's a key thing, is learning the fucking language.
Yeah.
Yeah.
This is reminding me of the story that my friend Tessa told me, who I still want to have on sometime for an episode about temp work, and maybe we can have her talk more about.
Yeah, I really want to do that episode whenever that's able to.
But she went on a cruise with her boyfriend's family. I think it was her boyfriend. No, maybe it was her mom's family. I don't remember. Not important. But with one of their parents' family, and it was to like the Caribbean. And she was saying there was one part where they unexpectedly had to get off the ship and like cross the island for some reason. And it was like this Potemkin village thing where like the resort that they had been on looked really nice, and then they go through like the actual part of the country that the people really live in, and it was just completely different. And the cruise line was like trying to like shield their eyes from it so they wouldn't have to look at it.
God,
it's just nuts.
Yeah,
yeah.
I mean, yeah. Go ahead.
I think another thing with the the different types of tourists is like, you know, there's the people that call themselves travelers who are like generally they have people serving them all the time. And when they're traveling, they also have people serving them. And then there's the people who are regular workers who, like, they are serving people all the time, and they want to escape from it by having other people serve them for a change.
And that's the difference. Yep.
Yeah. Which I think is a good segue into our work life section.
Yep.
So I think, obviously, the ideal situation would be to abolish all obligatory work.
Yep.
I've written an article for the zine that I used to do. I haven't done one in years, but basically the end goal of communism is to free everyone from all obligatory tasks, including, you know, if you don't want to, you know, eating, sleeping, all of that shit. We need to free ourselves from our social and biological limitations and engage with each other purely out of love and not out of just not out of obligation, but because it makes everyone better for interacting with one another. But until then, obviously, there will be an expectation for able-bodied people to chip in for a few hours of work. But without people doing the like huge amounts of unnecessary work to maintain the state, the bullshit jobs that Chris was referring to earlier. People will be free to, you know, just contribute a small amount of work for the things that people probably won't be volunteering for, like building. Maybe I think a lot of people probably like building stuff, but like more laborious tasks like harvesting crops, you know, carrying boxes around, cleaning stuff, like taking inventory, shit like that. And I think like manual labor is exercise, and so people who want to stay in shape, whereas now they, you know, go to a specialized building to do completely pointless lifting of, you know, heavy pieces of metal. Instead, they'll just carry boxes around or harvest crops or hammer nails in or clean, and that's all exercise.
Yeah, I will stand up for the honor of exercise. I absolutely, I do agree with you. I do agree with you because I've grown up, again, you know, in fucking rural places, multiple rural places, not just Indonesia, but also the Midwest, where there's a lot of manual labor. There's a lot of, you know, just
keep in mind that I've lived my entire life in the suburbs, so I'm kind of a dumbass.
It's totally fine. It's just good that they poked holes in the box that they keep you in. So last until now.
Well, they're not very big, you know.
Yeah, right.
And the smell is not great.
well, it is birthday. Yeah. So like the sort of you know, what you might call traditional, but just manual labor is good for your body as long as it's not injurious.
Yeah.
Which it can be, but it's primarily injurious under, you know, industrial capitalism, and like state agricultural projects and like these kind of state pressured construction projects and stuff, like the fucking Great Wall of China, for example, all the people that died doing that.
Yeah.
You know, anything like that. So, but that's always because of violence involved. There's the implicit violence that is causing you to do repetitive movements that end up injuring you because like you're just trying to get the fucking thing done,
or so because it's designed that way, like with scientific management and like assembly lines and stuff.
Yep.
Yeah.
And so there's that, but in a more sort of utopian proper production mode, people would be able to take the time to do it right, both for the work itself, as in like the process and the output and the outcome, but also for their own body, right? The ergonomics of it. And so that would be very good exercise. But I will say that being somebody who works out and who is constantly thinking about like my posture and how to walk more effectively and less injuriously.
As soon as you said posture, I straightened up because my posture's so bad.
Everybody sit up straight right now. So things like that are also very good for you to take on as like a self-discipline, and also a way to, for example, there's when you do work, if that's all you're doing physically is a particular set of tasks, often you develop these asymmetries. And that's one thing that regular exercise is good at, essentially just balancing, so that, again, to prevent injury. So that's, we're going to segue from this into the next thing. But basically, exercise is in many ways preventive medicine, as long as you're able to do it, and as long as you're doing it correctly, which you can train to do, just like you can train to drive a car, ride a bike, make your bed, fix a bowl of cereal, right?
Yeah.
So,
and before we do transition, I just want to add one more thing, which is like I think that like we kind of fetishize high tech processes or like automated labor. I mean, I'm for automation as long as it's to reduce toil, but I also think that like people working together to do manual labor is like really cool, and like,
oh hell yeah.
What the thing I always think of is like this video of like these guys in Thailand who are doing the task of pile driving, which is normally done by this big crane looking machine that drives these big stakes into the ground or whatever.
Yep.
And it's just these guys that have like they're standing on this platform that's attached to this thing they're trying to drive into the ground, and they're just all jumping up and down at the same time to push it into the ground. It's fucking awesome.
Yes, I love it.
I love shit like that.
That's just like true bro moments. Just
yeah. That's true brocialism.
yes, exactly. Just jumping up and down on the same fucking pile. That's great.
Yeah. Before I ruin this segue, so the next section is health, and we're talking about preventive medicine. So since you didn't ruin the segue, you want to get into that?
Sure. Yeah. The best medicine is preventive, generally speaking, as long as you're able to prevent it anyway, right? There's plenty of things we can't prevent, like if unpredictable, like genetic conditions and things like that, or even the predictable ones that you just can't intervene. But anyway, so like most medicine, generally speaking, seems to be.
The best medicine is preventive, and that's why we need to abort anyone that has Huntington's.
Oh God. Yeah. That's why we need to abort irony, bros, so that we will spare ourselves this horrible social disease. But then we wouldn't have this, I was gonna say, then we wouldn't have this delightful podcast. So yeah, like the vast majority of avoidable illness basically does come from state society. Like when you look at like the records, this is one thing I do love about like archaeology and anthropology, especially, is they're like, oh yeah, like these, sure, like there were certain skulls in this area that like had like worn down teeth and stuff, but that's because they were eating grain.
Yeah.
And so then they're like, oh, and then they developed a tooth infection. Everybody died when they're like 40, and
yeah, 20,000 years ago, everyone was normal, and then starting 16,000 years ago, everyone started getting bone lesions, except for rich people. I wonder why that is.
Basically. Interesting. Yeah, and like everybody had like just horrific conditions. After all this stuff kicked off.
Non-state peoples are an average of like 8 inches taller than state peoples.
Yeah.
until the late 20th century.
Right, and that was basically only because of like when you look at things like the fucking industrial world's middle class and upper class, and kind of the expansion of these like imperial classes, basically, just taller and taller people getting more and more out of other people. I don't know. I can't speak to the numbers, but we all know what we're talking about. So yeah, like you got these grain-based diets, you got these large complex cities.
Yeah, people packed really close together in cities and apartment buildings and schools and workplaces and all this stuff.
Yeah, and pollution, like the whole thing about like garbage piles. Like archaeologists are always finding weird shit in ancient garbage piles, and figuring out all kinds of things about society just because there's so much of their fucking garbage. And then they're like, you look at the world now and you're like, oh well, I guess we haven't changed that much. It just won't go away anymore. Like we've produced so much like synthetic.
We've invented bags to keep the smell in.
Right, pretty much. And then of course, like with the rise of class society, as essentially as what, like the how would you say this, like the backbone of state society.
Yeah.
Then you've got all sorts of people, the base of the pyramid, and of course to some degree the middle of the pyramid, like all these stressed out managers. Everybody just kind of hates their lives, but they've learned to accept it because they're like afraid of consequences. They are not organized enough to do much about it, or they are organized but they're in competition with each other in some other way. Because of ethnic or religious or regional concerns or just general paranoia. Mm-hmm. And, of course, that's also mental illness, So basically the state had the outcome of producing all of these horrible health conditions, and all of its vaunted, solutions and promises really don't amount to much when, like, you're not going to get. Typically, you're not going to like solve your diseases and your mental health problems and stuff just by complying with the state, which is what it always says will happen. Right. So it's a real mind fuck for everybody. And that's why we have to promote utopian communism, etc.
Broke Medicare for all, woke, abolish the state.
Exactly. The source of all ills.
Yeah. I mean, I know I've mentioned it multiple times on the show before, but like one of the things that makes it so obvious is there's multiple studies on the health effects of suburbs and just the fact that it uses this nonsensical subdivision street layout that is good for property developers and nothing else. Rather than the more reasonable grid street layout that's good for navigating and efficiency and just all this other stuff. Just that difference alone means like higher rates of diabetes and obesity and more auto fatalities because people drive faster on those streets and are more likely to hit pedestrians. And it takes longer to get anywhere because there's there's not necessarily a connection between point A and B. Like my friend used to live like half a mile from my house, but instead of taking like if I were to walk there, it would be like a half-mile walk because I could like cut 3 yards and stuff. But to drive there, it's like 2 miles of road because I have to go around all these like weird curves and stuff. I can't just go straight from A to B. So yeah, it's just like
alienating.
It's crazy what the environment can do to your health.
Oh my God. I will say, like, when I moved to DC, even though a lot of DC is rather lovely, on purpose, of course, a lot of it is also very like poorly upkept, because, and this is actually flying right in the face of the whole private property argument, because it's private property, it is poorly kept up, right?
Yeah.
Because they, all these fucking irresponsible, owning class types, they just don't give a fuck unless they can flip it, or if they can flip it, they want to just run it into the ground first, etc. So I was like living in a part of town that was rather poor, and I was living in just like a shithole apartment, and like I was developing worse and worse like mental illness because like I was really uncomfortable. My room had no ventilation, all this stuff, and it was because that's all I could afford at the time, and that's a big part of all of this. And it just was one of many factors, but like my panic attacks were more frequent. These days I live in a nicer part of town, even though it's more costly to me. which is very, very annoying because for so many reasons, That
place is so fucking nice, though.
It's a nice place. We got very lucky,
Yeah.
And I'm a little sad to leave it, but it's just one house.
Yeah.
But like my mental illness has receded somewhat, and like my attacks are very manageable. They're not like full blown panic. They're more just like these kind of when you feel really skittish for about an hour or two, and it's coming from anxiety, but like you can sort of breathe through it, think through it, manage it, And I think it's partly because my home is now more of a nest and a haven and like a safe place, and it's not an oppressive architecture.
Yeah. Yeah, and we haven't even mentioned really like just the general stress of being in society, of like, having to submit to a boss and to all these bureaucratic systems.
Yeah.
And like, just the ambient like toxicity of like everything that's around us. I mean, like literal toxicity, like
yeah, exactly.
Like drywall is toxic, the paint that's on the walls, and the plastics that are all around you, like just everything has all these like toxic materials in them.
Yep.
Mainly derived from oil.
Yep.
Just because that's just how state society works, I guess.
Yeah, it's really weird, like how much
Romans salted their food with lead because they lived in a state.
Yeah, exactly. It's just bizarre how like cultures of states just compound their like unnecessary evils,
Yeah.
Just they go after like the worst thing every time. They're like, well, we could put lead in it.
It's like that. There's a Bill Hicks thing about marketing where he's like, how was work today, honey? He's like, oh, good. I sold lead materials to baby bottle companies.
Exactly. That's actually one reason why, like, I've as a writer, I've had such a hard time even getting close to getting into like copywriting and stuff. I've done a little bit here and there, but mostly like on a contract, just minor stuff. But I was like, I can't even imagine writing ad copy or something.
Oh yeah,
because like 90%, 99% of the products and stuff out there are not just garbage, but actually detrimental.
Yes.
And I'm like, I have like a mental block when it comes to trying to sell that stuff. I'm like, even if I wanted the money, I would be incapable of writing whatever it took to sell that shit. I would just sit and stare at the screen until it'd be like, sorry, I can't do it. I'm sorry. It was like, walk away.
We have no real transition for the next section, so let's just get right into it. So the next section we have is clothing. And Chris, you don't have to agree with me on this, but I think it's pretty clear that we will progress to the peak of clothing, which was achieved by several indigenous tribes in like the Pacific, which is the penis gourd. Yes. Which is just a gourd that you put over your penis, and that's all it is. So production of clothing will be very simple. You grow gourds until they're big enough for your hog to fit in, and then you hollow it out and you put it on.
Yeah.
And that's the end.
That's anybody who has.
You don't have to be ashamed anymore.
Like it, just put it in a gourd.
Except of your penis, because penises are bad.
Well, it depends on the penis, I guess. Just depends. But yeah, like we could do that. Personally, this is actually one thing I was thinking about the other day about like conformity and like the kind of like the Puritanism of like white fascism in particular, which it sounds like a fucking redundant term, but follow me down this brief tangent of just like there's all these like insecure sort of Christo-fascist types and just like bland.
This is basically the plot of Kill La Kill.
Oh, really?
You're talking about.
But basically, yeah, like they don't like people taking chances and being creative and doing things differently, and so like just like this insecurity just like piles up. And there's all sorts of other reasons they go fash, but like it's just like a fash impulse is like they want to be style. You know, they it's the Richard Spencer effect, right? They want to be stylish and suave and sharp, but they're also just like, you know, like a fucking bread roll stuffed into a Ziploc bag, you know, and they will never look good in that. They're just like, they don't know what they're doing, and they're envious and bitter of like people who are like, yeah, actually in my culture we wear fucking feather headdresses, we look badass as fuck, by the way, but if I see you wearing that at a party, I'll kick your ass, you know. Like, you know, shit like that, right? Like,
yeah,
clothing in culture, whether it's state culture or not, like clothing is really awesome. I love the possibilities. I dress, as some people have said, pretty quote unquote normcore. I don't know how to feel about that, but you know,
I'm very normcore as well, just because I don't know. Well, I mean, I think the main reason is I don't know where to get cool shit, and also like most of the time I feel like I just sit around at home all day. There's no reason for me to dress up.
Right. In my case, I was always going for like the kind of just like simple will do kind of look. Mm-hmm. Just like I have a consistency in my style. Just while we're in this topic of me and my lifestyle, but just like I just like to keep things very simple overall. This is actually part of like what I was saying about like you move a lot and you keep things simple, because like how many fucking trunkfuls of clothing?
Chris has like Chris has like 25 items in his room total.
yeah. So for me, like I don't know if it's normcore so much as just like extremely. I don't want to call it utilitarian because that's like libertarian sounding, but like, you know, extremely just like keeping it simple, no frills or not
Spartan.
Too many frills, just Spartan.
Yeah.
But not like
except not Spartan because they're statist. Yeah, and
right,
pedophiles.
Exactly. Yeah, I don't want to be a statist or a pedophile. You know, I'm gonna uncheck that on my paperwork. But yeah, like anyway, the whole point being like even though I keep it simple, I love seeing flair on people. I love seeing people do that. You know, I try to be creative. I like people being creative. And I also like people being able to be simple like me, or like do whatever the fuck. Like if somebody wants to, you know, if Richard Spencer really wants to wear a blazer that's like 2 sizes too small for his pudge, like that's fucking his choice. The problem is when they're enforcing that on other people, right? And also like the beauty of a non-state culture would be basically people choose their clothing based on need, availability, and essentially creative impulse, right?
And what he really needs is skincare, not a suit.
Yeah, exactly. Skincare and like maybe some soul care. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
I don't know, but beyond that, like it would be just clothing production would be essentially based on kind of like with like the community kitchen restaurant thing, like. There would be people who would be better at it. They would be the specialists. You know, you'd have tailors and stuff, and those people would love to do that. You know, and they could
fashion icons. I think we would still have fashion icons.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. There's no reason not to. It's like because then it would just be about creativity and lifestyle, and lifestyles would be so free and diverse. But
they would just be cool people that you know, instead of like
exactly, and
you know,
like,
millionaires.
Oh, shit, dude, I can't believe like you did that. I want to do that too. So then you start copying them, just like in the real world, but not in this horrible, pressured like catwalk kind of way. You know, and you're not overproducing. I mean, like textiles and clothing and all that related industry is like one of the core industries of like classical capitalism, right? Like just
I think fashion is one of the key features of capitalism. Like the style changing constantly thing. Yeah. Like really took really like started going really hard with capitalism.
Yeah. And if you
Victorian
think about
fashion and all that shit. Yeah.
Yeah. So if you think about how we were talking about grains as you know, they're easily quantified, they're easily stolen, they are you know, they all have essentially these like discrete seasons and things like that. And you look at the way that fashion works under capitalism, and it's exactly the same thing. And they come from crops. So it's essentially a sort of a doubling over of a crop industry, if you will. Like they take the transformation of a crop into a commodity, and then they just do the whole fucking scheme.
And we use cotton instead of hemp, man.
Right.
It's not even the best thing to use.
I mean, I think fashion is one of the ways that actually they, what do you call it? Like reinforce the myth of progress. Because if you feel that you look differently, like your material culture is that much different from 1 generation, 2 generations, 3 generations ago, 100 years ago, 200 years ago, which is just a natural outcome.
Fucking 10 years ago.
10 years ago, right.
10 years ago, shutter shades were cool.
Right? And so you say, oh, well, you know, my culture now is cool and hip.
Right.
And therefore it's advanced and...
We don't look like dorks now, unlike before.
Yeah, exactly. And so then you fall into this like little mind trap of believing that like, because... you know, your fucking Forever 21 bag is slightly different from it was before, and because it's conforming with a current wave of similar kind of patterns, then, oh, well, this is the way now, and this is cool, and I'm hot and young, or I'm like fucking whatever it is. Then, you know, you become an anarchist or something, and you realize that it was all just a ruse, and you're living in a nightmare. But we don't have to have that.
But goth is forever, so...
Goth is forever. We can have goth solidarity.
How about, let's learn about learning.
Yeah, learning. Well, obviously, you know, in a utopia, reading will just be abolished because paper is civ.
Well, I think a little bit unironically that written language is civ. Because it's... the purpose of it is basically to standardize like knowledge so that you can replace someone as a knowledgeable person with someone who can read a book about it, you know?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, I
don't know if I'm making a lot of sense, but
I would,
yeah.
Yeah, I was going to say I would go more with like Öcalan had, Abdullah Öcalan had his idea about how kind of... and he was drawing on Bookchin, of course, but so I don't know the extent to which like this is just Öcalan's idea or if it's just like a development of Bookchin's idea. But how early civilization seems to have, you know, like civ and sort of state society seems to have developed such that like these like male priest types took over. Right. They created like a class for themselves by... and they use things like writing and like accounting and as a
widespread literacy is a very, very new thing historically.
Yeah, exactly. And so that was like a way for them to create and maintain a particular kind of hierarchy so that then and of course you also see that like often, if not always, often women are not taught to read in these traditional cultures, and so that goes right hand in hand with the whole idea of like the ancient patriarchy being key to the survival of the state. You know, because you immediately, and this is definitely Bookchin's idea, you immediately subjugate like, you know, half the population or more, and so when your supposed success as a society, right, under the state mythology, depends on some specialist being able to read and write, and then they won't, because reading and writing is a learned system, they won't teach it to anybody except the people they prefer, then that becomes an immediate hierarchy. Like that's just automatically like a superpower. Mm-hmm. And so that's
another point that James C. Scott made in Against the Grain was that state societies valued reading a lot, and non-state societies were exactly the opposite. They were what's the word? Disparaging, or like they looked down on reading and stuff like that, and reading and writing, and they really favored oral transmission of knowledge through like myths and all that. and it kind of reflects how knowledge actually is, where like it's always contextual. So a book will eventually be outdated. Like all knowledge needs to be updated for the context that we currently live in. So I think there is something to the idea that like writing isn't as valuable as we might think it is. I mean, it's good for like, historical records, but for like being like the main form of like transferring knowledge, I don't think it's good at all.
Right.
I mean, we are talking about learning and not just like reading versus speaking, but like in terms of learning, like I went to college for it was supposed to be for 4 years. I went for 6 years because I'm a bad student because I hate all that shit. But I studied computer science and I could not really program anything like practical when I got out of school. I got the vast majority of my knowledge, and I consider myself a really good programmer. I got the vast majority of the knowledge from like just doing it. And I think that's the case with any kind of learning. Just about you like the best way to learn is by doing it or watching someone do it.
Exactly.
Yeah. And yeah, so I think utopian pedagogy should replace or should reflect, that idea. And I guess reality, I don't know. I haven't read any evidence about it, so I won't say that it's like an objective truth.
Right. Yeah. And that's actually, the sort of the advantage of like tacit knowledge and, practice and things like that. Those are very high. And like, another thing that I learned from growing up in the places that I did, especially in Indonesia, was that, like in specific areas where I lived, if a young person wanted to learn an essential skill, they would just go and they'd watch the person at work. The elder, right? Who was working, and they would watch them, and it was one of these interesting things where it kind of reminds you of like the apprentice to journeyman to master, sort of highly structured training and career path. But in this case, it was like less formal. It was like some 4-year-old or 6-year-old or 12-year-old goes and they just sit and they watch like the woodworker, right? And they watch them doing the woodworking, and they watch how they hold the tool and when they do a thing and how much pressure they put on, everything like that. And they don't touch that shit until the woodworker basically allows them to do so and to try something, partly because in these cases resources are precious, and tools are not easily replaced, right? So this is a very traditional economy we're talking about. But also because it's like, well, why would I let you try if you haven't paid attention, if you haven't basically put in the time to just absorb, which is actually kind of how learning language works too, is you have to do a lot of passive listening and watching people to really get good at the language you're trying to speak.
Babies learn to understand what you're saying way before they can say anything themselves.
And that's actually how language basically works, is you'll always understand, unless you have like a brain damage condition or something. You'll always understand more effectively than you're able to personally verbalize.
I can still understand French, but I would probably sound like a dumbass if I tried to say anything in it.
But it's also true of your own.
Same with Japanese.
Exactly. It's also true of your own mother tongue, is that like you just receive more effectively than you can transmit. Which is like advantageous, but it also means that like that right there seems to me to confirm like that socialism is ingrained. Like it's a natural like need, and it's an advantage, when we work together, right? But
and that speech is superior to writing because you can understand speech way before you can understand writing.
Right. What else about this? I mean, I just put down here like a lot of this is kind of what I said anecdotally, but a lot of the actually important learning that is needed to sustain, right, the stuff that's not bullshit jobs, right, will kind of be learned somewhat by osmosis, because you'll be able to observe everyone around you constantly doing useful stuff, because that's how this will work, right? You'll see people cooking and you'll smell the cooking, and you'll see people doing woodworking and you'll understand the shapes that are, emerging and what they're for, because nobody will have to hide behind a defensive screen of bureaucracy about what they're working on, because it's like, well, duh, it's apparent what you're working on and why it's important, right?
Yeah.
Literacy.
And I think in general there would be like less specialization. I mean,
like overall,
for one thing, because there's going to be fewer jobs overall, because I don't know about most, but like a huge chunk of jobs are just invented for the management of the state.
Right.
Wouldn't be necessary at all. So there's no reason to specialize in those, but also because like a lot of specialization is only there to make workers easier to control, and there's no reason to have that, in the future. So
I was actually thinking about things like, I've listed here 4 examples of received skills, things that are hard to pick up on your own. You have to kind of be trained: literacy, woodworking, electrical engineering, and nursing. All those things have some degree of complexity. They require tools. They require a study of like the a particular kind of sort of like guided study of the subjects that you're dealing with, things like that, right?
Yeah. I mean, even cooking.
Yeah, cooking, exactly.
Yeah.
Like, you can figure some stuff out in any of these sort of disciplines or skill sets, but like you can figure sort of random stuff out in basics.
Yeah.
That's fine. But like it's also dangerous in terms of like nursing or electrical engineering,
right.
Or even woodworking if you're trying to build anything bigger than like a box, And so, or like literacy, if you're trying to write a poem and then, as who was it? Like Charles the First,
inspire the masses to revolution.
Well, right, exactly. Like, I think it was in the Pax Britannica podcast that I was listening to, where Charles Stewart was trying to write like a cute letter to the Spanish, like fucking, what was her name? Spanish princess or something.
Okay.
And he was.
I think it's pronounced
about
princesa.
Princesa. Yeah. And he said something about like the ambassador who was facilitating their like communications, and meant to say something like, this guy has been very helpful, or like this guy's like my great helper, and he accidentally used a Spanish term which was a colloquial like term for like a pimp. And so he basically said, like, yeah, this guy's really pimping you out to me. Like, it's great. So it's like, that's the sort of thing that in literacy is very dangerous too. So, I will say there are risks, but, social risks. But like, those are things that you can see that are like immediately important, like their uses are obvious. And the specializations that might be necessary are like, more people can do these things. Like literacy can be widespread as a skill, right? We know that already. Like there's very few people that like proportionally few people that have like a real true struggle learning to read and or write. And those people, they might have like a learning condition or whatever. With woodworking, it's going to be physical. So if you have like a physical disability that you can't woodwork, or you have to do an adaptation, like get a prosthetic, or you have like, if you're one of these people who's super talented with like their feet instead of their hands because they have whatever. I don't want to get into the fucking weeds with this, but like, or electrical engineering, if you have an issue with like color blindness, so you can't tell which wires are which, right? Like classic problem. And nursing probably similar to all of those three, there's,
or if you have this disease where you're vulnerable to electrocution, like a pathetic weakling.
Never me. That ain't me. I've never been. I actually, when I was a kid, I got electrocuted off of a bare wire that was like just hanging out there and like completely blacked out. It was like, my parents thought I was like gonna have brain damage. So
I've been electrocuted before, but then I was like, that's it.
You're like, what? That's all you got?
Yeah. I'm not even kidding. The one time I have been electrocuted, it was very weak. So
I've been electrocuted a few times. It's always a weird.
So I'm pretty sure I can just grab onto bare mains wires and no problem for me. So.
Oh man,
just immune to it. Just like I'm immune to all drugs.
Right. Oh man.
Nobody can tranquilize me.
I think about the times I've been badly electrocuted, and it is not fun. But
yeah. I had a high school friend who got struck by lightning and showed me his feet, and I was like, that's fucking terrible.
Yeah. Not great.
Yeah.
But yeah, I was going to say about this is that like more people can take on these skills, and this is another thing like you said about like controlling workers, right? Is like when I got into these arguments with chuds online about minimum wage $15, both I think of them said, oh, you want to fucking pay a fucking burger flipper $15 when EMTs only make blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, Jesus Christ, fucking shut the fuck up, first of all.
Yeah, I was having that argument today.
Yeah.
Like, just before the show.
People always bring up fucking paramedics and shit as if it's like the big fucking argument.
Well, the person I was talking to was an EMT.
Oh, great.
And was like, if you think that licensed professionals deserve the same amount of money as a burger flipper, you're delusional. And I was like, they should be paid the same, actually. Just, sorry if that offends you.
Yeah, right. You take yourself too seriously. Yeah. But here's the thing: is like as this kind of economy develops, like more people can do those like what do you call them? Like kind of high stakes kind of work. Like, because you're not being forced to fucking show up to work for like 40 to 80 to 100 hours a week to just scrape by and pay rent and feel like shit all the time. There can be more people. And
if you get injured, you won't be enslaved by the healthcare system forever.
Exactly. There can be more people available to help people with emergencies, and they'll be available at more of the time because, again, most people most of the time are going to be in free time,
Yeah.
And so you're like, oh, I fell off a ladder and I broke my neck, but I'm salvageable. And like, oh, there's a fucking building over there with like 5 out of 100 people who are just like, yeah, we know how to deal with this. We'll come right over, and they can treat you. And 2 buildings down because there's fucking hospitals on every block,
Yeah. Lots of kids want to be doctors.
Exactly. Like, why shouldn't they be,
Right.
Why shouldn't everybody be at least, people always crow about how much everybody should do first aid training, right?
Yeah.
Like, oh, everybody's got to do first aid training. It's like, it's so essential. And you're like, great. Well, why don't we just make everybody, some kind of...
just pay for everyone to do that.
Yeah, pay for everybody to do that. And give everybody some new medical training every fucking season so that you just know more and more shit, That would be fantastic. I don't relish the idea of using a syringe, but lots of people fucking use syringes on themselves for good or ill, and that's a skill,
I'd get used to it.
Yeah, exactly. And it's like, first aid is basic first aid is not even scratching the surface of all the other things that you could do just as a nurse. And then beyond that, there's all the fucking like.
I will say though, I highly value the skill of being able to use a needle well, because almost every single time I've ever had my arm stuck with a needle, it's hurt. But the last time I got stuck with a needle was like 3 weeks ago, and the nurse who stuck me, like, I wasn't looking at it because gross. But I didn't really feel anything. Like, it literally was like the thing that they always say, which is like, oh, you're going to feel a little pinch. Yep. It was a little pinch, and then that's it. Like, whereas other times it's like, yeah, this is more like it kind of hurts a little bit, but
right.
Okay, a little pinch, sure.
Yeah. So and this is the interesting thing is you could have, again, instead of having like 1% of the population or like 0.5% of the population being like a medical specialist and all these other costs causing them to charge you all this money. And this is the thing that people forget when they talk about like, well, I need to be paid this much. And you're like, yeah, you say you need to get paid that much because like you went into fucking medical school and it's a whole racket, you know?
Yeah.
Like it's the same fucking difference. And we should all just get off.
And because we have a rationing system where you need money to alleviate your poverty, which is enforced by the state that you live in.
Precisely.
So we aren't going to have that anymore. You can just get whatever you want.
Right. And also,
the advantage of being a doctor is it's a thing that you want to do because you like helping people. And if you don't want to do that, then like you probably shouldn't be a doctor because the whole thing is helping people. And if you're only doing it because you're being forced to by a rationing system, you're probably not going to do a very good job at it because you don't really want to be there.
Yeah. And I was going to say, actually, I'm glad you made that point because it saves me making that point, but I was going to add to that point. And if you're doing it for a reason, like to be quote, like to be a higher class than people, which other people do, especially like doctors and shit, they're like, oh, I'm going to be bougie by being a doctor, then like you really shouldn't be a doctor because you're a fucking asshole. Like, so it all kind of comes out in the wash.
Yeah.
But we've kind of beat that horse to death. Radical pedagogy, I don't know much about it yet. I would like to, but I feel like there's Little Red Hood Schoolhouse, which is a podcast that kind of touches on like education stuff from like a left perspective, and I think some of the other podcasts run by academics, such as Coffee with Comrades, but that's not the only one. I think if you just listen to those podcasts, they will be able to tell you way more about like learning, pedagogy, school, etc., than like I could come up with in 30 seconds. So just go find those podcasts.
Cool.
Yeah.
So let's see. Do we want to do do we want to do both of the sections? We're at 1:40 on the recording right now.
Oh yeah.
Probably 15 minutes or so of that is the pre-show stuff.
Yeah.
And then I'll probably be able to cut out like another 5 minutes or so. So
yeah. We kind of leisure and play are kind of essential.
We touched on it a little bit. We didn't get super specific about it.
Yeah, like we could go real quick through it, like not have to flesh it out too much, just be like, like, yeah, of course we'll have a lot of free time, and like that means more time for games and more time for like, your own like fitness lifestyle if you want it, your own athletics, your own, yeah. So we could just kick that off and then go straight into ecosystem.
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right. Yeah. So like speaking of like people being available because of their free time to like everybody be a little bit of a nurse, everybody be a little bit of an engineer, everybody be a little bit of a whatever, and then like
and falling off ladders too. I think
yes.
also relates to this.
People will also be more free to fall off ladders, yeah. So basically, everybody ideally, and this is kind of one of the key goals of this of rearranging society, is to like literally just not just free people in an abstract sense, but like free people in terms of time and their bodies to do things that are fun and beautiful and good, and that are like biologically necessary and healthy, and recreational, essentially, is what I'm saying. So like right now we already have all these things that people want to do that we're constantly either paying to do or volunteering to do when we can, or finding ways to do despite wage work. But it's like athletics and fitness, games of all kinds. Most of us love playing games of some kind. Even if it's just like silly, like social games, like fucking, like pranks, or like stirring up
6 Degrees of Kevin Bacon.
Yeah, or that shit,
We played that so much in high school, which, as Foucault pointed out, is like a prison. So one of the things we did in our high school prison was play 6 Degrees of Kevin Bacon.
Yeah, and that's the sort of game that you could actually play without Kevin Bacon. Like you,
yeah, exactly.
With anybody, you could be like, so and so at like
make this social network connect. That's the game.
Right, exactly. So and so at like the at the Elgin commune in Chicago. Like, how many connections can we get to that person? Right, whatever.
Yeah. 6 degrees of Murray Bookchin.
Yeah, right, exactly. It'd be great. And then also, like I said, like people who choose, like myself, to pursue some level of like disciplined fitness, we can do that, and we can have more time to do it carefully and like methodically, and like try different ways to do it, whatever it might take, which is actually like these days in our society right now, that's like more the preserve of like a professional athlete. Like those are the people who have had the drive to make their quote unquote job out of athletics and fitness so that they can spend all that time to do it. But then again, more people can do that with more time. You don't have to be like rushing through your fucking routine if it's something you do routinely, whatever.
Yeah.
And so and again, like just like what we were saying about repetitive work, as a result, you will be probably less prone to injury, and you will also not be driven by this utopian culture to do things like fitness and athletics and like sports and stuff to establish like primacy and supremacy and like to make yourself
social connections.
Right, you might do it for social connections, just for fun. You might do it for
politically advantageous social connections, I should say.
Right, exactly.
You will not do it for that. Yeah.
Right. And like you see like players who get rich and become capitalists,
Yeah.
Which like I see, I think we know the kind of this is the lay of the land there, but like but then also, the constant question.
If they're black, it's good, and if they're white, it's bad. we'll just say that.
Right. And then other questions of like, like speaking of like the prison of high school, the constant fucking like popularity contests that often involve things like, physicality generally, because of like people going through adolescence and becoming sexual and all this kind of thing, so that like athletics and sports become almost inherently sexualized, especially in a highly toxically competitive society, where you eventually expect to be competing with each other pretty much for like indirectly over life and death. Am I going to have a shitty apartment and worse mental illness and less good food, or am I going to be like popular and paid a better salary and whatever, and like you said, political connections come into that, right? That's all part of that political sphere. But like in a utopian eco-communist society, it seems that, you could get into sports more purely for the fun of it, right? Without worrying about what we do now with things like sports, which is like mini nationalism, and like chauvinism and shit like that.
I would be interested to know if we know of any sports that non-state societies have.
That's a great question. I have no idea.
Yeah. I know neither of us know that because neither of us are into sports and wouldn't have looked that up. But maybe that's something we could look into for an episode. That'd be really interesting.
Maybe we could have a guest on that knows more about sports than we do.
Yeah.
But also things like music, all these other recreational activities and like kind of pastimes and indulgences, like all the arts, music, books of various kinds, and not just books, but like
we'll still have 808s in the communist utopia, I think. But also wood instruments are pretty cool too.
Oh yeah.
That's what I'll say.
And like fine arts, just for the pleasure of it, right? Also media, because media is kind of like
more murals. We'll have way more murals.
Honestly, I love murals. Yeah, that'd be awesome. And and it would be like a lot more vernacular stuff, because again, it wouldn't be a class society. So you'd have all kinds of stuff that people just do, and they say, hey, is it cool if I put up a mural here? And whoever lives there would be like, all right, let's get a consensus on this, and then, and they could decide how they want
to draw flowers or weird freaks.
Right. Because we're kind of both into both, like weird freaks and a bed of flowers, just like,
what if you draw freaks with flower crowns? That'd be cool.
Yeah, right. It'd be great, and they'd be like, "Oh, actually, I was thinking I could do it with a kind of a, yeah." So that'd be great. And then like, I was thinking about, we could basically, obviously, the most obvious application for libraries is this kind of stuff, especially to my mind when I was taking notes, reproducible stuff, right? So you can make copies and distribute copies, and useful stuff, kind of like the tool library that I never quite made use of in Seattle, but where basically, it's just like they talk about in Seriously Wrong all the time, it's just a library of stuff that you can go and check out and use and bring it back. And then there's stuff that doesn't have like a use value or an exchange value, but has like just a cultural value, and those would go in like a museum or a gallery. Then, of course, anybody could just walk in and be like, that's really cool, and just enjoy it for free because it's just fucking there because somebody made it because they wanted to, or they could just have it in their own home or just out in the street or whatever, as long as it's not knocking, it's not like getting in the way of the streetcar or like whatever the fuck, right? But that's just up to the people in this far-flung, beautiful future. And then, of course, another great thing about free time is that for people who are into having sex, they get to have more sex. And people who are not into having sex, they can do all that other shit that isn't sex, but that it won't be like constantly marketed to people because obviously it's no longer commodified. And also because people will be like, well, yeah, I have sex all the time. Why would you use sex to sell champagne? Like, like that's absurd, Sometimes I pour champagne on my sexual partner, but sometimes whatever. Why are you saying this thing about champagne? I don't get it. Why are all these images here? Yeah.
Yeah. Personally, on the 420, 666, 69 graph, I am full 420 and 666 and 069. So that's all I'll contribute to that section.
Nice. And as we know, it's only champagne if it comes from the champagne ecosystem, and if it's not from that ecosystem, it's just Evian or something.
All right, so the last one we have is the ecosystem.
Champagne ecosystem.
We've talked about this a lot, so we can go through kind of quickly. So I mean, obviously public spaces will be built to accommodate the ecosystem because we have to coexist with it. We can't beat it back or anything like that. Oh, your mic isn't picking up? Oh, Una's in here.
I've got 12 minutes. I'm on break at work.
Yeah. Oh, shit. You missed us talking about Kill La Kill briefly. Yeah, so we're just talking about the ecosystem in a eco-communist utopia.
Oh, cool.
So, what would your ideal city skyline city look like in an eco-communist utopia if you had to integrate it with the ecosystem?
Well, I think one of the simplest things that like cities do modernly is tram tracks don't actually have to be on pavement. So you can kind of, except the issue there is, of course, that it has to be shortened, so you can get to that.
Right.
But just that sort of general thing of limiting any pavement to areas where it's absolutely necessary for accessibility. So basically, just have the entire city just be a forest with trails.
Yes, I have this vision as well, and I want it so bad.
Trails with ramps that don't necessarily have to be concrete. And in fact, they don't actually have to be concrete at all, and they should not be concrete.
Yeah, right. It should be smoothly interlacing root systems, that just create
giant mushrooms.
And giant mushrooms. They sort of bounce a little bit as you use them,
Yeah.
Yeah, you jump on them and they propel you high into the air, and then you you can just move left or right on the screen. In midair, just by bending your legs in that direction.
It's all about aerodynamics.
I mean, it is a utopia.
That's funny because that was actually the first point that we had in this note section was streetcars instead of
cars.
Private cars or whatever.
Automobiles.
Yes.
Automobiles,
And another thing I would say is designing for the solar envelope, which basically means like taking into account which direction the sun is at various parts of the day and year, and making sure that everyone gets enough sunlight.
Well, what I'd want to see is like
yeah.
integration of the solar envelope with like canopies.
Yeah.
Yes.
Which I think, generally speaking, the issue with all of this is the fact that cities, if we view cities as like what they are now, they're essentially, you know, density of concrete rather than density of people. Whereas, like, economically speaking, the point of them is to be density of people. So if we're going to continue that, which I don't see a reason why not, necessarily speaking, fuck you, Bookchin.
Disease.
Yeah, but like I feel like we got over that a few thousand years ago. But like we should really focus more on like how to integrate a significant amount of people with an ecosystem rather than a significant infrastructure with the ecosystem, and then just sort of work from there.
Yeah.
Like the ecosystem doesn't have to be like destroyed by the infrastructure. It could really, you know, work well with it in a sense.
Yeah.
I definitely say there's like a, you know, from going to NOLA that one time in my entire life, the fact that like the streetcars just like don't give a shit that people are in the way and just sort of wait for people to move, like that sort of thing would definitely
that's pretty cool.
Yeah, because like especially if you consider like if you actually have an ecosystem, then there's going to be you know, fauna, and you know, rather than oh shit, the light rail hit another deer like we'd get up here in the Midwest, it's much preferable to like the there's a slight delay because there's like a bunch of deer on the track, which is fine because, you know, rather than having a system that requires, you know, absolute punctuality, you kind of just have to work with what's there at the time.
Because say what you will about Hitler, but he did run over all the deer.
God. Oh my God, those weren't deer.
Fuck.
Jesus.
Bringing it down with a Hitler joke.
Every damn time.
He poured a lot of concrete, so...
Yeah, right. He was a real concrete freak. Hitler.
That's the typical American thing. Say what you want about Hitler, but he poured a shit ton of concrete building roads that weren't even his idea. You'd be like, wait, isn't that bad?
Right.
So this is weird. You also hit on our next point, which was deer. So Chris wrote in here about Nara Deer Park in Japan, where the deer are friendly and will bow to you.
Yeah, it's so awesome. You bow and they bow back, and it's so fucking good.
There's also a group of deer in the Scottish Highlands that I have met that are friendly, and they will let you feed them breadsticks. And the main buck of the group is named Lefty because he's blind in one eye.
Radical.
I love it.
There's a video of me feeding the deer breadsticks. It's fun.
No, my thing about deer, right? You get a lot of jokes about the fact that deer are scared of people walking or biking, but not of cars, which isn't true at all because, you know, obviously they understand that cars will fucking murder them, just like people understand that. But the point is, when you're in the dark, and, you know, usually deer are, when they're around where cars are, it's the dark because they don't really want to be around people. A car isn't really an object in the dark. It is a bright spotlight, a la the fucking Rapture. So you could imagine, like, how they don't really see that as so much a threat as just like, shit, the world's ending.
Yeah.
Which...
And also, like, if you're running around at night, then you have night vision, and then all of a sudden you get blasted in the eyes by some car headlights.
Right. Which, like
you can't see shit.
Me as a human commuting home at night, I get that same fucking issue because, It's not like it's that dark along the road I walk down, but people have their brights on because there's trees, so it's got to be dark. Duh. And,
Right.
you know, it's just very difficult, you know, from like a social or ecological perspective to interact with things like that because you cannot see. Like, the only thing in that area that can see is the thing producing the light, so it kind of dominates via light pollution, which I think is kind of wild.
Light is status.
Truly.
Yes, basically. That kind of light.
Yeah, I
anyway.
feel like, you know, light pollution is kind of overlooked in that, since, you know, it does create a very unnatural base level, which, you know...
Yeah, I want to be able to see the fucking stars. Damn.
Right.
Yeah, that would be nice.
Which, of course, mock me all you want for moving to fucking LA, where I'm never going to see them again. But...
Well, you'll see a different kind, which is way better.
Well, yeah. I love parasocial relationships.
You could be parasocial friends with Jeremy Renner.
Right.
Yeah.
Camp out on the hills with your face to the parasocial relations.
But like, I think that's a much bigger concern than when people are like, "Oh, shiny building make birds do dead," and like,
right.
I mean, sure, glass causes reflections and it confuses animals sometimes, but like, I feel like that's really just a drop in the pond of the amount of confusing shit we do as an infrastructure. Like, say, the PLSS is really fucking cool when it comes to how to divvy up more land than you could ever use to people that want to use it all for some reason. And, like, you know, there's that, but it doesn't really make sense on a natural level to, like, oh, you want to go one town over. Well, you actually have to go 2 towns over because you have to go through this other town because they're all at 90-degree angles.
Yeah.
So, you know, it's just ant paths. We should copy ants. That's my point there.
Let's see. We have this holy shit, but what about section. Chris, you put that in, I think?
Yeah. I just was like, I know that obviously this is kind of just like getting into like, of course there's complexity and of course there's exceptions and like not everything, there's not going to be uniform utopian communities. And so this is the sort of thing where sometimes when I'm
all wearing uniforms in the future, and we all do the same thing all day. We pulled the same lever in a giant machine.
I feel like you didn't really talk about Kill La Kill.
But he mentioned
we were talking about fashion and how we're all going to wear penis cords instead of having fashion excellent. Because modesty is fascist.
You should come on my podcast and talk about Kill La Kill.
There you go. Ryan, sounds like you got a new job.
Yeah.
But go on about
Congrats,
this
man.
thing that we were talking about that I already forgot about.
Just like you know, there won't be uniformity. Like, this is the very definition of ecology, right? Like, you're responding to what's around you, and so I was thinking about like things that I've had doubts about in the past, and also things that I've either heard or that like I probably will hear from people if I ever bring this up to them about how this could work. They'll be like, well, you know, like what about like living on an island? What about living in a desert? What about living in a, you know? And like, of course, it won't be fucking uniform. People will respond to their, you know, their environments to get what they need, but the principles abide. You know, principles.
Right. Ecology
and
isn't
the
uniform,
modes.
so the way that you deal with ecology necessarily.
This is right. Exactly. And like, I think the other thing, which is my third section there, really is another way which people sort of tend to object, is just like the transitional concerns, which is like, well, that's also something that you'll just kind of have to solve as you come to it, right? Like, how do you ensure optimal?
What I say to that is, forget about
the
it.
Japan thing where they just rip down entire neighborhoods and rebuild them.
Yeah.
Or the Chinese thing where they just build an entire new city and then everyone just moves into it later.
Hell, we could do both. Like, just build the new city, have people move there, then rip down the old one and rebuild it. Easy peasy.
Yeah.
It's like your standard sorting algorithm.
Yeah. I mean, it's basically in is it Oji, where the central Shinto shrine is, and like they basically, once they're finished building the one, they start building the next one, and then like when that's done being built, then they tear down the old one.
Yes.
And they just keep doing that.
I gotta go back to work.
Just
now,
do that.
Fuck.
Oh no. Okay, we'll have fun.
Oh, I will.
Later.
Bye.
Bye.
So, I mean, so that was an appropriate timing because we're about to wrap up anyway. But basically, a couple more questions I just have here, which like I think are worth thinking about when we think about how do we get from hell to utopia, and we are in hell. You've got how do we ensure optimal outcomes across all these various diverse regions and ecosystems? Like how do we make sure that the best things can happen for people? Again, I don't know. And I don't know is the answer to all these, basically. But, like, obsolete and possibly dangerous structures and infrastructures, again, this is transitional. So, like, what do we do about, like, the fucking depleted uranium?
Old nuclear reactors.
Exactly, right, the classic example. Or, like, the Pacific plastic gyre thing, like... All these things that are, like, the relics of especially capitalism, but also some other things. Also, how once we get to, or as we go to utopia, how do we try new things? How do we deal with innovation, actual innovation, even as we're embracing more caution and more, social justice and stuff like that? Like, how do we decide that we're going to do one thing instead of the old thing? I think that's more of like going to be like a tech ethics kind of question, as much as anything else. Also things like fuel use and also the use of other risky materials along the way, like what's acceptable, what's preferable. And then I think questions of trade, as what I was thinking specifically with this one is like as different parts of the world hopefully approach this kind of utopian eco-communist sort of world or mode, and other places don't go as quickly, or they do it in a different way, right? They morph in a different way toward the same goal, so that like these are all still diverse places, they're all still imperfect, right? All this stuff. Like, how do they deal with questions of trade and say inter-regional relations as they all kind of ramshackle build up towards something better, And I think that's just something.
How do I get a freaking banana, man?
Yeah, right.
If we're not forcing Guatemalans to grow them for me.
Exactly. Like, if they have more bananas than they need, then we can still trade, but it's just going to be a question of like, how do you do that? Conscionably, and I think this is I just want us, you and me, but also all our listeners to like kind of meditate on all these questions of like that transitional set of concerns, how we go from here to what we dream of every day, Yeah,
I think that's a good spot to end it. So if you enjoyed this episode, check out our other episodes at neighborsciencepodcast.com. Give us a review on iTunes because it helps people discover the show. We have a Patreon, patreon.com/neighborscience. We have some bonus audio for our non-time sensitive 2-part episodes. I'm going to be starting to do early release on the second parts for some of those. So you'll be able to hear both parts of our episodes right away. And that's at any Patreon tier. We have a Teespring. So if you want to get a shirt, then we have those on there. I still have to make time to put up stickers and the new shirt design idea that I have. But I'll do that eventually. I think that's it.
Yeah.
Right.
I think that's everything.
All right. Thanks for listening. Bye.
Bye. Nice. Yeah, that was a fun one. I think that was way lighter and just like